Dana White, the UFC president, should be commended greatly for bringing mixed martial arts to a wider audience. He has, of course, been known to make a few errors and even lie from time to time. Keeping that in mind, these are some of the worst lies told by Dana White. Number 10. The Reebok deal. When Dana White says that something is going to be good for the fighters, what he really means is that the thing in question is going to be very good for the UFC. And if the UFC grows because of it, then maybe the fighters will benefit. The issue with the infamous Reebok deal wasn't so much the uniforms themselves, or the low bonuses that the fighters were paid for wearing them. The problem was that virtually every fighter lost thousands of dollars in regular sponsorship deals due to their inability to wear custom shorts. Hundreds of fighters felt the negative side effect of losing out on potential sponsors. Fighters can't have independent sponsors when they walk into the cage now, and financially, it seems to be a huge disaster for the fighters. So despite what the UFC president originally claimed, the Reebok deal, or the Venom deal for that matter, were not actually good for the fighters. Number 9. The money fight. The UFC has often said that it will never co-promote and that they will never allow a fighter to compete in another sport while under contract. These things were written into UFC law so clearly that fighters would rarely try to look at potential opportunities outside of the promotion. However, when Conor McGregor burst onto the scene and proved himself to be a next-level pay-per-view draw, Dana White had a change of heart. Originally, White was adamant that a boxing fight between Floyd Mayweather and Conor McGregor would never happen. Of course, when the fight materialized in 2017, Dana himself was standing on the podium as a co-promoter, introducing his fighter for a press conference in a sport that was most certainly not mixed martial arts. Number 8. Pride never dies. When the UFC took ownership of the legendary Japanese promotion Pride at the height of its fame, it stood as a merger between the two primary powers in mixed martial arts. Dana, at the time, claimed to be a fan of Pride, and promised the fans that it, like Strikeforce a few years later, would remain intact, serving as an affiliated promotion with its own place in the MMA world. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. As soon as the UFC took over, Pride and Strikeforce were basically dissolved there and then. With many of their rostered fighters jumping over to the UFC, Dana White has shown himself to be a pretty ruthless businessman when it comes to his competitors. But on this occasion, he wasn't exactly honest to the UFC's fans. Number 7. GSP will never fight again. The funny thing about Dana White saying that a fighter doesn't want to fight or will never fight again is that sometimes it turns out to be more of a taunt than anything else. But in the case of George St-Pierre, it was quite hard to know why Dana was distancing the promotion from what was set to be a truly massive comeback. GSP hadn't fought in 3.5 years, and after a career spent in the welterweight division, he appeared to be readying himself for a run as a middleweight, a major departure from his relatively safe approach to his prime career. But even when it seemed certain that St-Pierre was coming back, Dana wouldn't budge, telling the fans that no such return was happening. Was he trying to misdirect us, or help himself at the negotiations table? Whatever the case, it was clear something fishy was afoot. Number 6. 90% mental. Dana White is the type of guy who is more than willing to give his biggest stars some leniency here and there. But if there's one thing that he has no tolerance for, it's fighters who pull out of events with excuses that just don't cut it. Whether or not Amanda Nunes was actually too sick to compete at UFC 213 is anyone's guess, but when she ultimately pulled out of her title fight with Valentina Shevchenko just a few hours prior, to say it didn't sit well with Dana would be putting it lightly. The UFC president pretty much buried Amanda Nunes there and then, promising the world that she would never headline a UFC event again. In his own words, her issues were 10% physical and 90% mental, and that if she really wanted to fight, she could have. Jump forward just 2 months later to UFC 215, and guess who the headliner was? It's pretty safe to say that Dana White proved himself wrong in record time on this one. Number 5. The funky one. Ben Askren and Dana White's relationship over the years has been pretty rocky, to say the least. Not only has Ben Askren never been afraid to speak his mind and criticize the UFC, but his status as one of the greatest fighters to never compete in the promotion made him a pretty big what-if. However, when he decided to leave Bellator in 2013 specifically so he could join up with the UFC, Dana decided then and there that he didn't want to sign him. Whether it was because of his past comments or even just his wrestling-heavy style, Dana opted not to make an offer. Instead, he told the media that Ben Askren just didn't want to fight in the UFC. This, of course, wasn't exactly truthful. Askren had left his home at Bellator just so he could finally challenge the best fighters in the world. And though he would eventually make it to the UFC several years later, he was well past his prime at that point. Number 4. Jeremy Stephens' arrest. Understandably, the UFC and Dana White will often go to great lengths to make sure a scheduled bout goes down as planned. However, this next one was clearly beyond saving, something Dana White was reluctant to admit. Back in 2012, just hours before Jeremy Stephens was set to face Ethan Edwards, he was arrested on assault charges for an incident that took place a year prior. That news alone should have been enough for the UFC to announce his removal from the card. However, despite his arrest and being held without bail, Dana White insisted that the fight was still moving forward as planned. The UFC didn't even announce its cancellation until the very last second when they were actually on air for the event. Of course, anyone following the news that morning knew this outcome was inevitable, despite Dana White saying otherwise. Number 3. Women's MMA. One of the most controversial comments made by Dana White was, of course, his infamous statement on the possibility of seeing women fight in the UFC. At present, there are a total of 4 women's divisions in the promotion, which includes stars like Valentina Shevchenko and Amanda Nunes. Of course, back in 2011, after being questioned by a TMZ reporter about seeing the UFC open their doors to female athletes, Dana's response was a pretty conclusive no. What he didn't anticipate, however, was the emergence of one of the biggest draws in UFC history in the form of Ronda Rousey. Her arrival on the Strikeforce scene caused a pretty rapid change of tone from Dana White. And the rest, as they say, is history. Number 2. Not for sale. Okay, so we're not going to get too hard on Dana White for this one. As the UFC was starting to make a real dent on the mainstream world, it was only natural that its market value would skyrocket, especially when they had a crossover star like Conor McGregor at its helm. So when rumors began to circulate about a potential takeover from WWE IMG, fans began to wonder whether the UFC was headed for a major change in ownership. Dana, without blinking, repeatedly told the media that no such sale was going ahead, and that the Fertitta brothers were still in charge. Naturally, few actually believed this, and shortly after, the promotion was sold for $4.2 billion, with Dana White staying on board as the company's president. Number 1. Deontay Wilder money. If there has been one constant throughout Dana White's negotiations over the years, it's his tendency to try and change the narrative surrounding the fighters he's dealing with, often pointing to them as being unreasonable. One such occasion came up when Jon Jones was first talking about a move up to heavyweight. According to Jones himself, he was simply looking for an increase in pay that better reflected his worth as a pay-per-view draw. In response, Dana White told the media that he was asking for Deontay Wilder money, $30 million to be exact, in an attempt to discredit his actual argument for better pay. Jon Jones immediately denied this, sharing his side of the story in a series of tweets. The simple fact of the matter is that the UFC prioritizes their slice of the pie over everything. And if Dana has to bury a superstar to ensure his company's success, that can sadly happen on occasion. As always, if you guys enjoyed the video, please be sure to let me know by leaving a like and subscribing to our channel. Apart from that, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.